Hello, everybody. Glad to see some folks already joining us here. I am Juan Pons, and with me is Jaclyn Merica.
Hello,
Um,
be here.
and I guess we got to be doing a little introduction. I know most people here know who we are, but so I am Juan Pons again. I am a wildlife and nature photographer, and happy to be doing these image reviews live. Jaclyn, do you want to say something about yourself real quick?
Absolutely. Hi, yes, I'm Jaclyn Merica. I am Juan's assistant and have been for the last good part of the year. I am mostly a portrait photographer, but I'm really getting, I'm excited to go to Costa Rica very soon and Maine and some other places next year and start to dabble in wildlife photography too. I'm really excited to be here.
Very cool. So yeah, so this is our second image review live. I used to do these, I've done these on and off for the past, I don't know, 10 years or so. And when Jaclyn came on board, she's like, oh, we should revive that and do it again. So, and I thought it was a good idea. So, and now people are more used to participating in these online type events. So I think there was a great idea to start doing these again. This is the second one we've done. We're going to try to do these once a month. I can't promise that we'll do them every month because there are some months, especially in like January time frame, that are really, really, really busy for me, where I'm actually gone, traveling on workshops for most of the month. So those times a year may be a little challenging, but we'll try to do these once a month. And we're getting an incredible amount of response. You guys have been sending images. We have 12 people that sent in images this time around. And great thing is a lot of folks sent us before and after images, which actually is great because it allows us to see what you were thinking when you were editing the images. But the other thing is that I've asked for people to send 3 images, and some people have been sending more than 3 images. But even when we're asked for 3 images to be sent, for example, the last session we weren't able to get through all of the images that you guys sent in. So I'm thinking that we may limit them down to 2 images per person, coming up soon, or maybe even one if we get a lot of people submitting. Because I don't want you guys submitting images and then not being able to get to them or whatnot. So a couple little housekeeping announcements. The first one is, and typically the way that we do this is we'll go through and do 1 image per person. And then we'll go back around and do a second image per person if we have time and so forth. The other thing that I really like to say before I do any kind of image reviews or feedback sessions is that, this is just my opinion. That's all it is. So you could ask somebody else, or Jaclyn may have a different opinion on a particular image that I may be talking about. So, take that with a grain of salt. We're trying to help you by giving you constructive criticism. But, the most important thing is for you to like the image that you've made. That is by far the most important thing. As long as you like the image, it doesn't matter. One of my things, or one of the ways that I approach photography is that I shoot for myself. As long as I like the image, that's all that matters to me. If other people like it, that's great. But I have plenty of images that people think they're kind of ho-hum. And part of it is because those images connect with me. And some of the images you may be submitting, may connect with you at some emotional level. So that's why you like those images so much more. But they may not connect with me. So, I may be looking at it from a totally different perspective. So always keep that in mind. Always shoot for yourself. Don't rely on somebody else's opinion on a particular image. Anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I am just really grateful for everyone who contributed and everyone who is tuning in. Yeah, these are just, this is a forum for discussion. I really encourage people to contribute to the live chat as well, and we'll answer your questions and get some insights into your images. So yeah, thank you all for being here, and really look forward to discussing further.
Yeah, I can see the live chat here. Can you see the live chat over there, Jaclyn?
I can.
Okay, good. And can you
Yeah.
reply? I think you can reply, right? Right on the interface?
You could, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yep, I
Excellent.
had a Bonnie, Jennifer, CA, Marina. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get started here and let's take a look at the first image. And this is an image by Bonnie Davidson. Oops, hold on a second. Press the wrong button here. Okay, here we go. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the great things about this is that, a lot of you guys submitted a before and an after image. In this case, this is the image as it came in, I suspect, from the camera. And if we look at this one, this is the edits that Bonnie did on the image itself. And I think she did it actually really, really well. One of the things when I'm editing an image, and one of the things that's most important to me when editing an image is the composition, right? Because without a great composition or a great subject, the image is nothing, at least in my opinion. And so the very first thing that I do when I'm editing an image is to crop the image. And a lot of people say, you should crop to a particular aspect ratio to an image. You should do an 8:10 or 11:14 or a square crop or something like that. And if that's the way you like to crop, that's fine. I don't follow any aspect ratio guidelines, if you will, when I'm cropping an image. I crop the image to the image itself to make the image, shine and to try to portray my subject and portray the image in the best light I possibly can. And it does look like Bonnie did the same thing here. It looks like she cropped, in an almost portrait aspect ratio, but not quite. It's almost square, but not quite square, which I think works really well for this image because it really, creates, breaks the image up into the rule of thirds. We have the stem of this flower coming in at the left third of the frame. And we have our butterfly kind of, the center of gravity of the butterfly, which is, this area around here, is also along this top third of the image. The butterfly itself is not on one of the PowerPoints. And for those of you that don't know, the PowerPoints are where the lines intersect in the rule of thirds. But that doesn't matter here. I think that is still pretty strong composition because you do have those elements in the scene kind of falling between those rules of thirds. Now, one of the things that I do notice here that nice that you paid attention to this is that you don't have a collision between the antenna and the wing of this butterfly. So that is, always be on the lookout for that kind of stuff so that you don't lose the definition of that antenna as it merges with this wing over here. So good spotting if you did that on purpose. If not, that was kind of a happy accident, but that's one of the things you want to take a look at. Now, there's one thing in this scene. There's a couple of things in this image that I would try to do a little bit better. And one of the things when you're looking at image, your eyes are always attracted to the brightest part of the scene. And there are two things here that are really drawing my attention. This bright spot on the lower right, this leaf, is so bright and large that it competes for my attention in the scene. My eye wants to look at the butterfly, but it gets getting drawn back down to that bright spot. So I would try to tone down that a little bit. Or even when you're shooting, pay attention to those things and maybe try to position yourself in such a way that you don't have those bright spots. So by moving a little bit to the right, you may have been able to then move that bright spot to the right of the frame and not include it. That would have also had the advantage of shooting those wings at a more parallel plane to the camera. So when we zoom in here a little bit, you can see that, our when we're shooting macro like this, our depth of field is pretty shallow. We can see that the line of focus or the plane of focus is right along this diagonal here. And we have a bunch of stuff here that's slightly out of focus and a bunch of stuff out of here that's slightly out of focus. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you were able to position yourself such that the butterfly wings were more parallel to the camera, you would have a deeper depth of field and be able to see more detail on the butterfly than you are able to see here. The other thing that I wanted to mention is if we zoom in and we look at these bright spots, these look like there's hardly any detail there. And I want to be able to see some detail in those parts of the image. And if we look at the histogram, we can see on the right-hand side, on the histogram in Lightroom, that area is clipped. It's all the way on the right of that edge of that histogram display, which means that you've lost information here. There's no texture to be seen. It's just almost pure white. And we want to be able to see a little bit of texture there. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you are capturing this image. If we look at the original, we have a little bit of texture here, but it's still a little overexposed. So, my rule is always to be exposing for the highlights. And what that means is that you want to make sure you don't overexpose those highlights. Mm-hmm. So what do you have any feedback, Jaclyn?
Yeah, absolutely. I do really appreciate your comments on the aspect ratio and how it can either really benefit an image or it could, detract. Perhaps there's too severe of a crop. I do really like this crop though, and I like the composition, and it does really kind of adhere to the rule of thirds for me. I would, I agree with you about the highlights, and I also wonder if you could get some more contrast, some more of like the black point really improved in this. And I would also encourage maybe a little adjustment with the saturation too, maybe a little less saturation of green so that more of the black can really stand out.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a couple of quick edits here just to demonstrate a little bit what Jaclyn was talking about. And oftentimes what I end up doing when I'm editing an image is I will, or when I'm adjusting contrast in a scene, I will do that using a tone curve. And the way that I use a tone curve is by putting in 2 points on the tone curve and creating a gentle S-curve. In this case, I don't necessarily want to bring the highlights up. Maybe I actually want to bring those highlights down a little bit and then bring the dark parts of the image a little more to add a little bit of contrast to those wings. You see that just by that slight adjustment, how much more contrast I'm adding to the scene. And I prefer to do this over the contrast slider up here on the basic panel because this allows you much finer control, and I can also adjust which part of the dark tonalities in the scene I am going to darken by moving my handle on that curve up or down a little bit. So in this case, I really want to bring the dark parts of the scene a little bit darker. So I'm going to move that handle further down in the curve and move it down to add a tiny bit of contrast in there. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's great.
So I want to move on to our next image so that we have time to talk about some of other people's images. Let's take a look here. And this is an image. Let's take a look at the image by Carol. And this is the image as she took it. It looks like, this is probably a captive flamingo, if I had to guess. Because of the background that we're seeing is very uniform. So, it's kind of interesting. Flamingos are absolutely beautiful creatures. And they're so graceful looking. But the background that it's in is kind of sterile. So it doesn't tell me a lot about, or it doesn't make for such a pleasant image. But if we look at the edits that she did, which were more artistic, she kind of brought out that background and made, create a complementary background to our subject while still creating kind of a glow effect behind it, I think works extremely well, especially in a situation like this where you had a kind of dull background. I would still prefer to go along the same lines of what we talked about earlier, to have a little bit more contrast in the scene. So again, I'm using the tone curve to add a little bit more contrast to our bird, to kind of give ourselves a little bit more, punch, if you will, to the image, and make it pop out a little more against the contrast that's there. It's not a big, huge change, but you can see the difference between that and this. You see how our subject kind of pops out of the image, out of the screen a little bit more. The other thing that I always see people do that I would recommend in this image is that you kind of get down to the eye level of your subjects. And you're almost at eye level here, but not quite. We're still looking down at our subjects. You can see how we can see so much more of the top and maybe not as much as the bottom of our subject. And when we look down at our subject, we kind of diminish them in the frame. So I would encourage you to get down a little bit and kind of shoot at more eye level to your subjects, because that makes them grander in the scene. It makes them more prominent in the image. What do you think, Jaclyn?
Yeah, I really loved this image and really appreciated the edits and the other files that were also contributed by this photographer. I really like the choice of the background color. I think it really helps the flamingo pop, and that kind of highlight, like rim light behind the flamingo as well really helps to backlight it and make that curve of the neck pop. One thing that I did notice, when I was first receiving this image, if you zoom in to the selection around the feathers, this is something that's really a challenge. I'm sure a lot of people have experienced when you trying to select something from the background. And so there are some areas where it can be improved with just a little more finesse and a little more, the selection tool with some opacity variants. And try to get as much detail of those feathers in there, because then it really would pop even more from the backdrop and that new background color.
Yeah, that's a great point, because oftentimes, when we use, you have to kind of work on that selection tool, because oftentimes when you look at this edge, it looks really sharp and crisp, but by the same token, it kind of looks superimposed because of that, right? So oftentimes not being as tight on that selection and feather that selection a little bit, like you were saying with the opacity, or even feathering the pixels out, expanding them a little bit, can make that transition a little bit softer than it is. Like you can see, especially down here on the lower right and on the lower left, how that transition is so sharp right around those edges. So that, that's something, and that just takes skill and time, and you just have to work at it to get to the point where it's, it's kind of second nature. But otherwise, great job. I really like the image. I like the flow of our bird. I love the colors, everything about it. Flamingos are just absolutely stunning creatures. So, and it's great when they curve their necks like this.
Yeah, I think it's a great edit. Thank you for submitting that.
Okay, so let's take a look at our next image. Real quick, by Steve Nimzik. Okay, so this is the before and after, and this looks like an Icelandic pony in Iceland. Maybe. Maybe wrong, I'm not sure. But, Steve was, if I remember correctly, Steve went with me to Iceland a number of years ago. If you're on, Steve, chime in and let me, or correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't remember this. So this must have been a second time you went to Iceland. So anyway, so this is his resulting image, which actually I think is stunning. I think he did an amazing job at cloning out that handler on the left, and then adding some background to the scene. I'm assuming that he did that using content aware fill. Yep, and Steve just chimed in. He says definitely an Icelandic pony.
Yes.
So I love the reflection. I love the fact that you provided room for our subject to move into. That's, absolutely what you always need to be doing with wildlife or people. If you want to, especially when there's movement around, you want to make sure you have more room for our subject to go into. You didn't crop in too tight, so you're giving me a lot to view and a lot to absorb, and you still have such a strong subject that our eye is drawn to our subject and its reflection in the water. So I think that from a composition perspective, you did incredibly well. You included some of the clouds out there, so and gave us a lot of breathing room because the background is really, really, really interesting. Now, having said all that, there's a couple little things I would do to improve the image. And a lot of them have to do with content aware. Content aware is an incredible tool, but sometimes you can see here how this curve in the background, this curve in the back, this is repeated here. So we're having some repetition. And same thing with this and same thing with this. And possibly this and this over here. And maybe down here as well. So one of the things that I do when I'm using content aware fill and I see those repetitions is I will go in afterwards and use the clone tool or the heal tool and add some variations to those lines. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just, change them a little bit by cloning or healing around those lines so that you added some variation to those and it doesn't look like these repeating patterns in the background. So that's the one thing I would do to this image to improve it. And again, up here in this area here is where you can see it the most, and maybe a little bit down in the tracks that handler had left behind. I may even try to, get rid of some of those a little bit and make them a little less conspicuous. But I love the action, the hooves up in the air, the sand exploding. One of the great things that you did here is that you have a little bit of separation between the top of our horse and this line back here, which makes the image that much more pleasant. These tiny little details oftentimes can make the difference between a good image and a great image. So what do you think, Jaclyn?
Yeah, I really agree with you on that. That's exactly what I was going to comment, is that I appreciate that slight separation right above the horse's head and ears. It's a similar color tone and everything between the horse's color and that kind of goldish color on the mountain behind it. And so I think any other, a different, lower perspective and that meeting of that horizon line with the horse's head, I think would not have really allowed for this image to flow and breathe the way it does. I love the action, I love the reflection. Would you mind going back to the raw image as well, please? I just want to see what that reflection looks like comparatively. Yeah, I think this is really, really well done, and I appreciate just the motion that you caught, and that wet sand being flung up is really beautiful. So I think it's a great representation of an Icelandic pony if you've ever seen them.
Yeah, and the light on it is beautiful. The way you were able to bring out the light on the pony is absolutely stunning. And I do like the fact, like you said, the background is pretty monochromatic, but the light as it's falling on the horse and the color of the horse really makes it stand out. So it really draws our attention into it.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's take a look here. This is an image by David Stern, and this is his before image, or as the image was captured. Lots of depth of field here. I love the dew on the flower as well, and let's look at his edit. So yeah, very, very nice. I think you did a great job with the edits. There's a couple little things here that as you've noticed as we make this transition between one and the other. On the lower right-hand side, he was able to clone out this other flower that was encroaching in. And this is actually, he must have taken quite a bit of time to do this, because this can actually be, having done this before, this exact same thing, this can be a little bit challenging. And I think that you could have done a tiny bit of a better job right here on this petal. See how we can still see kind of a shadow of the old flower that was there. So I would try to clone that in. Again, cloning and healing is gonna help you with that. Now, Talking about cloning and healing, we've talked about that already in two different images. I typically do any heavy duty lifting like this, cloning and healing, in Photoshop versus Lightroom. Lightroom's cloning and healing tools are kind of not all that great. They're great for, spotting the image. Like if you have dust on your sensor, or if you want to remove like a power line across a blue sky or something like that, that you can do well in Lightroom. But any sort of detail work like this, the best place to do that is in Photoshop. And obviously you were already in you may have done that in Photoshop already. You were already in Photoshop because if you use Content Aware to kind of get rid of that, Lightroom doesn't have Content Aware yet. So, but I love, again, the depth of field here is awesome. The sharpness of the image is great, but it's not too sharp, meaning I can still feel the softness of those petals in the scene. Now, oftentimes, one of the mistakes that I see a lot of people make is that, we always think a sharp image is better. So they take that sharpening slider and they just like dial it to 1,000. You can't go 1,000, but you know what I mean. So, don't do that. Try not to over sharpen the image. Just bring enough sharpness in to bring out, those parts of the image that really need to be sharp, but don't bring sharpness to the parts of the image that don't need to be sharp. So what do you think, Jaclyn?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way that you describe kind of the softness of the flower, and that's something I think is a real strength in this image. In the edit, that it is still very soft and very real and botanical. Almost feels like you could go out and touch it, and it would be kind of a tactile image. It's beautiful in its framing. I really like the colors. I may say that maybe just watch going over with like certain saturations of certain colors, that like yellowish and pinkish color that occurs, right in the center of the frame, on the petals, that could have a chance to be overdone. But I think that because you want to just kind of see that like soft pink really fading out from the center to the edges of the frame. So yeah, I think that's a really great image, and I would love to see that like hung up somewhere. It's beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great comment about saturation, because most people I have found, like to push on that saturation tool. And the saturation tool is great, but you have to keep in mind that it's going to saturate all the colors in the image.
Right.
In an image like this, you may want to bring out, compared to the original, right? You may want to bring out some of those pinks and that yellow. I think that you did a great job doing that. But the problem or the drawback here is that it also made this green in the middle a little bit neon-like, little fluorescent. And so I would, and I'm not sure, David, I'm not sure exactly what you did, but oftentimes in images like this, I may go in and saturate the individual colors using the HSL sliders in Lightroom, for example, or in Photoshop. So you can saturate those yellows and you can saturate those pinks and magentas, but not necessarily saturate the greens. Now, I understand and I can see that there's lots of yellow in this green, so you may have to adjust that a little bit to make sure that your center doesn't get too yellow. But I think that this green is maybe a little bit too, too neon-like. And that's kind of the peril that we run into when we use that saturation slider. I use that saturation slider very, very judiciously. Most of the time I end up using more the vibrant slider, and then I go into the individual color sliders in the HSL panel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take a look at image here by Jim Benson. And I do know this waterfall very well. I used to, many years ago, I used to run many waterfall workshops in North Carolina for many years, almost 10 years actually. And this I recognize as waterfall because this was one of my stops on my waterfall workshops. And this is Esteto waterfall, which is kind of weird because it's in someone's backyard. Um, can you imagine having this in your backyard? It's absolutely stunning, stunning waterfall. So I think you did capture this well. But one of the challenges, though, with these waterfalls is that when you're going out there and capturing the water, or capturing the waterfalls, you want to be out there on a day that is overcast as much as you can. Because what happens is, just like it's happening here, you have some areas of the scene that are really, really bright and some areas that are, nicely exposed. So you want to try to get to either early in the morning so that the sun is not coming into this little protected area by the trees, or in an overcast day. Ideally, what you want, if you get very, very, very lucky, and the way that we get lucky is to go to the same place over and over again and shoot it in different conditions and different weather and different light. If you're very, very lucky, you have a cloudy day, which would then allow you to have a cloud casting a shade over the waterfall, giving you a nice soft light, and then allows you to have a blue sky in the background. Because this is one of the challenges with waterfall photography. If you can see the sky, oftentimes the sky gets completely blown out. So you always have to pay attention to that as well, which looks like what's happening here near the top of this image. The sky up here is really, really bright and blown out. So, I may actually, in an image like this, I may actually try to bring it down a little bit so that I don't have as much of that white up there that's blowing out my scene. You see how now our eye is not attracted so much to that top of the scene. As we mentioned earlier, your eye is always attracted to the brighter part of the scene, so your eye kind of gravitates to this area and gravitates to this left-hand side. So that's the challenge when you're shooting waterfall, especially if you're trying to do a long exposure. I'm not sure if he did a long exposure here. No, he did 1/200th of a second. So it's not a long exposure. So that's the other thing I would try to do as well is, and some people don't like it, but most people prefer to have kind of the silky water coming down of the waterfall. And for that, you need a slow exposure. And when you have water falling like this on a cascade, meaning the fall is falling vertical, usually shooting at 1/4 of a second is more than enough to get nice silky water. You don't want to use too long of an exposure because then you start losing texture in the water. So that's an idea to also use in a situation like this. Now, the last thing that I'm going to suggest here as well is, the waterfall is beautiful and, there's a lot of interest there, but you can make an image that much better by introducing some interesting foreground elements in the scene. So, and what I mean by that is, right now, if we look at the bottom, these foreground elements at the bottom, you have some really nice mossy rock over here and over here and over here, but you have this bright, naked rock at the bottom. Again, kind of bright. It kind of draws our eye in and kind of distract us a little bit. So maybe, compositionally, try to find an angle that maybe you have water in the foreground with maybe some rocks in the periphery, so you don't have a big subject like this. If you can't do that and you have a big subject like that, another trick that I would use is splash water on these rocks. Splashing water on the rocks, getting the rocks wet, will make them dark, so they are not as bright in the scene. And then if you do that in combination with a polarizer filter, it will remove any reflection off that rock, and the rocks get really dark. I mean, just think about it. Look at the rocks back here that are really wet. They're really dark compared to these rocks in the foreground, even though they're in the same kind of light. So just another suggestion, when you're out there and you have these kind of rocks in the foreground, just splash some water on them before you make the image, and you'll be able to darken those a little bit.
Definitely.
So what do you think, Jaclyn?
I also recommend, I'm looking at certain areas of the scene, the top right corner. I would want to see maybe similar lighting or some kind of edit to that top right corner as there is the top left. So maybe some dodging, some clone stamps, something like that kind of creates almost a vignette within the foliage of the frame and really brings your eye towards the water. And I
Mm-hmm.
also was considering what would it look like as like a dog's eye perspective. So getting low towards those rocks and getting them wet so that there's more contrast
And
and kind of
saturation, yeah.
depth and yeah, and then really getting a beautiful view of the waterfall that way and showing its magnitude. So I'm curious what you would do as well in kind of creating that vignette with that like that light that's hitting the left side of the frame.
Yeah, I mean, so, and I can talk about this image for an hour because I've been to this location, dozens of times, and I've taken over 100 people to this particular place. Typically when I shoot this, I like to shoot a little bit further to the right. So I use that foreground element of the water with a polarizer so I can see down into it. But that, requires that you don't have this sort of bright part of the scene over here. Because if you were a little bit to the right, you get to see this left-hand side. So yeah, you could add a vignette to the scene to darken that a little bit. And we can do that in Lightroom here real quick. We can do a dark vignette on the image, and you can see how we're bringing some darkness to this area around. So that is definitely improving the image a little bit and softening that light on the left-hand side. We still have this bright spot here in the center. So again, as we talked about earlier, always be exposing for those highlights. Pay attention to those highlights. You don't want big blinkies. And you guys know what I mean by blinkies. When you're looking at the preview in the back of your camera, you don't want areas that are just blinking at you. And pay attention to the histogram. You don't want the histogram touching the right edge of the frame of the histogram. You want it as close to the right as possible, but without touching. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Because again, we can spend, like I said, I can spend an hour on this because I've been there so many times. And we are a little bit more halfway through our time, and we're not halfway through the images yet.
There's so much good inside there.
So this is an image from Jovanna. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this looks like, and I think I saw in the title that this is in Death Valley, dunes in Death Valley. And this is something that if you're into, abstract and graphic kind of images, it's absolutely mesmerizing. You can shoot in basically any direction. I feel like you can close your eyes and take images and still create some amazing stuff. And I love the interplay of not just the lines of the dunes, over here, but also the texture that the wind has created and the shape of the light that we're getting. We're getting some shadows and then some light on both the upper left-hand side, plus all this sort of interesting texture that makes me want to look at this image more and more. Makes me want to look at the details, makes me want to look at the light. And I love this interplay. And I'm kind of a sucker for these images that have this warm and cold tonality to them. Whether they be sunset or sunrise images, or images such as this, where part of the scene seems to be in a cold light, and some of the scene seems to be in a nice warm tone light. So I think this is beautiful. I think this is great. This line is near our rule of thirds, so it makes the image, very compelling. And I feel like all that texture that we're seeing, all those lines that we're seeing, makes the image feel like it's alive. It makes it very dynamic, like it's moving.
Absolutely. This is so beautiful and so abstract. I love it. I thought it was two animals back to back at first. I thought that was skin. So I did not think those were sand dunes, and that's what's so compelling about this image, and the shadowing and the difference in color temperature. I think that's so beautiful. To me, that color looks very like gray blue, and then the bottom right looks very kind of orange, and so it's really nice, like complementary colors, and I really appreciate that. I think it was beautifully done. I would love to know what lens she was shooting with. Do you have the metadata with that?
We may actually. Let's see what it says. Come Yeah, I mean, this 100, so yeah, she used a 70 to 200. She was just shooting at 121 millimeters. You know, you mentioned something that is really important when we look at images like this, is that when you look at an image like this and it makes you wonder what it is that you're looking at, you know, it makes the images that more compelling because it makes us look deeper into the image, right? It makes us spend more time with them. And that's what you ultimately what you want from your viewers, for them to gaze into your image and look at it and kind of wonder what it is that they're looking at, and perhaps even come up with little stories in their head as to what they're looking at. Like you said, could this be two rhinos back to back, you know, with their,
Yeah,
you know, tough skin, or two elephants,
that's what
or,
I
you know, what
thought.
is it?
Yes, exactly. I think that's what's just such a great like aspect of story to this image, is that you can really just come up with, you know, how did those ripples in the sand get here? Where are those shadows? Is it a storm coming? Is it, you know, a sandstorm? So there's real beauty in this, and it's so simple too, and that's what's fantastic about it. It's really well done.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Oh, this is another one that we have before and after, and this is from Melody. We have a couple, but I think we have another butterfly even after this one in the selection. So it's very, very butterfly heavy today. Um, you know, there's lots of things that I like about this, but let's look at the edits that she did. So this
Wow.
is her after. This is the before, and this is after. And again, you know, there lots to look at here. You know, really nice depth of field. You see how we have the butterfly wings at a parallel plane to our camera, so we can see all of that butterfly nicely in focus. And it looks like we also have a nice deep depth of field, right? Well, actually 7.1, so enough depth of field to get most of this cone flower in focus as well. Couple of little things. I think the saturation may be a little bit too much in the scene. I love the background. I love the look, the painterly look of that autofocus background, but this blue over here and this blue and red over here are distracting from my main subject, which is, you know, this monarch butterfly, right? I want to be able to look at the butterfly, but my eye keeps getting pulled toward this really bright blue that's over here. That we see here as well, but here, because of the saturation that we added, that blue just became kind of an electric blue. So again, this is another place where I would, if you want to bring out some of those colors and bring out some of that contrast, use the selective tool on the HSL sliders to bring out the yellows and the oranges and the greens without bringing the blues as much. So actually, let me try this real quick over here. We'll go to the HSL sliders.
Well, and I have
Go.
a question for you as well, pertaining
Yeah.
to like pushing those sliders and pushing the like capacity of the image. You were noting like the kind of distracting blue color in the top left, and you
Mm-hmm.
see that like loss of detail, and almost it looks like watercolor in the back around that flower. You
Yeah.
lose detail in the orange, you lose detail in that like blue around the petals. What exactly is that called, and how do you ensure that that doesn't happen?
So one of the when you so and this is an example, something you actually an exercise you guys can do at home. Take an image that has someone, let's say, with a red shirt, and or even an orange shirt, but you can see this very clearly in a red shirt. And then take that saturation slider and move it to the right, and you will see that very, very quickly you will lose all detail on the reds. So reds are very, very difficult for computers and cameras to reproduce accurately. So you want to be very careful to add saturation to an image when you have reds and oranges in it, because those colors tend to get blocked up and you lose detail, complete detail in those colors very, very quickly when you add saturation to them. So that's why, you know, I shy away as much as possible from using the saturation slider. I typically use a vibrant slider instead of saturation slider, because a vibrant slider is basically the same as saturation, except that it doesn't saturate those reds and oranges as much as it does all the other colors. So in a way, it kind of protects those red and oranges. So that's why I prefer to use vibrance as much as possible, especially if there's any reds or oranges in the scene, because those tend to get saturated a lot quicker, and you start losing detail very, very quickly on those. So that's a great observation and a great topic to discuss. But you see how I kind of unsaturated that blue a little bit, and now it's not as electric as it was before.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So it's not as distracting as it was earlier. And it didn't change anything else in the scene. And all I did was take in the HSL sliders, the aqua and the blue, and tone those down, and tone the saturation down. You can also take the luminance down if you wanted to darken it a little bit so that it's not as bright as well. And maybe even do saturation even more. Because when you darken something, it kind of saturates the colors to a certain extent. So let's look at the before and after. That's what it was before I made the edits. See how electric that blue is? And that's when they're toned down a little bit. Maybe I went a little too far in toning them down, but you get the idea. So don't, make sure that you're not, bringing something or adding something to the image that's distracting your viewer. Make sure your viewer is focused on what you want him to look at.
With that before edit, that electric blue, my eye immediately went to the electric blue, and then followed kind of that connection between the flower petal and the antenna and the wing, and just kind of created that circle effect. Whereas it would be lovely, to get just a little bit of a different perspective and get a separation right there where your cursor is at the antenna, and have that kind of eye go just directly to that beautiful butterfly.
The other thing is to pay attention. Like I mentioned earlier, you did awesome in getting parallel to your butterfly, to the plane of focus on the butterfly, so you have really nice depth of field. But you see how these two antennas are touching each other? If I could, and it's touching the flower in the back, I would have moved a little bit. Try to change your perspective, even if it's a tiny bit, to try to separate those antennas and make it not collide with the background. Again, these are tiny little things that you look at when you're making the image, and those little details, take a great image even that further. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's look at another one here. I'm not sure we're going to be able to do one round even. Because, the great thing is we I like to provide a lot of feedback to people and kind of give them, not just talk about the image, but which is great for the actual photographer that took the image, but kind of give you ideas of what to look for and what to do when you're, in your own photography, even though this may not be your specific image. So this looks like probably an immature GBH or a great blue heron in some palmetto. In kind of a busy scene. And trying to look at, there's lots to look at here, and sometimes that can be a little bit distracting, but let's look at this is the before, or the image as it was shot, and this is the image afterwards. So there are a lot of little things that happened here. One of the things that happened is that there's a bit of cloning that took place over here on these little ends of those fronds. See how those are gone now? Which, I think worked really well to kind of draw us into our subject. The fact that we were now able to see a lot more color and more detail in our subject by enhancing our contrast and adding a little bit of saturation to the scene also works. And that saturation and the contrast also added some separation between our subject and its background as well. Which, here it looks like the subject is kind of, and the background is kind of the same tonality, if you will. Whereas on the after, there's a clear delineation and difference between the tonality of both our subject and the background. Now, compositionally, the image seems very static to me. I would have preferred, and I'm not sure what's in the background, but I think I would have preferred to have shot this in a horizontal or landscape mode and be able to see more on the right and provide more room for our subject to go into. With wildlife and people, providing room for your subjects to go into always adds to the scene and makes the image that much more interesting and flow better. So I think I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of the background, because this is kind of between like a portrait shot and an environmental shot. So this wouldn't necessarily be a great portrait shot because the background's so busy, but it could be a great environmental shot if you were able to include a little bit more of that environment in the background. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really great comment and suggestion to make, and not one that I would have thought initially. I actually really liked how kind of close in it is, and it almost is like we're peeking into its hideaway or, its nest or something. So it looks really, I really like the edits as well, that the bird, the heron, really pops. But I do agree, if there was any kind of like water right in front of, on the bottom part of the frame in the foreground, and then this little grassy kind of ledge that the great blue heron is perched on, that could be a really compelling image. You're right, because then you would get this sense that they're walking into their frame, and have more story and more background to that. So that's great context to introduce.
Yeah, I mean, in oftentimes you hear a lot of photographers when they give advice is, get closer. And most of the time that is true. You want to get close, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you provide context to your subjects. So,
Right.
the nice thing is nowadays with these high megapixel cameras or that we're all shooting with, we can afford to be a little wider and then crop in if we need to and still have plenty of pixels to be able to print or share. So always think about that. What about the context? What about the environment that my subject is in? How can I create a little story about the subjects that I'm photographing? Like we said earlier, providing an image that has, that allows your viewer to come up with a little story in their head or makes them wonder what is it they're looking at, what it is that it's going. Creates better images because it creates more interest in the image, creates more, people tend to look at those images longer. So they end up liking those images a little better. So always think about that, especially with wildlife. Try to, portraits are great, but try to include more of the environment. Try to tell a story about your subject or about its environment. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. And this is images by Jim, and absolutely stunning action that he was able to capture here. This is absolutely gorgeous. I love the action. I love the stop motion that he did with his mane, how the hairs on the mane are standing up, the expression of both of the horses, the fact that this horse has this one almost like in a headlock, and this guy looks like he is. I don't know, in a little bit of despair or trying to figure out how it's going to get out of this one. Again, I think I would have liked to have seen a little bit more room, a little bit more context, not a lot, but see how the tail end of this horse on the right is so close to the edge here. I would have liked to see a little bit more room there, maybe a little bit more room on the left to give me a little bit more air to breathe. But I do love the action. I just can't get over the action in the scene. And I mean, just this horse in the foreground is so amazingly beautiful. And the hair and the mane and the tail, the way that it's flowing, it's really cool. The biggest issue that I have with the image itself is that the image is what I call a little crunchy. Meaning that I think you may have overdone the sharpening a little too much, maybe too much. I wouldn't say even a little. I think it's a little too much, which makes the image, kind of crunchy and makes it, unnatural looking when you're looking at it up close. If you're looking at it at a great distance, it looks great. But, an image like this where there's so much going on, I want to get up close and look at the image, look at all this texture and all this detail, look at the expression on the face of this horse and look at the texture on the coat of this horse and the mane, all these different details I want to look at. But when I zoom in or I get up close to the image, it just doesn't look natural. It looks like, these hairs are alternating black and white. And that's what happens when you do a lot of sharpening. The other thing that you're seeing that here is that even though you shot this only at ISO 400, there's an enormous amount of noise in the scene. And the ISO 400 in any modern camera wouldn't have anywhere near this amount of noise. But what's happening is that when you are applying that much sharpening, guess what's happening? You are exacerbating or bringing out the noise that's there. And you are really highlighting that noise that's in the scene. So you're, in essence, degrading the quality of that image that you made, that camera that you spent all that money on produced. So, and then I also noticed that if you look here closely, it looks like there is some remnant of a clone job or something. You see this little circle here. So that's something you want to pay attention to, that you don't, maybe it was a mistake that you clicked on and didn't notice. So make sure you look thoroughly through the image and make sure you don't have anything like that, especially if you went to print it. Think what happened if you sent this to be printed on you paid a couple $100 to be printed, and then you look at it up close and you're like, oh man, look at that. So make sure you kind of go around and look in detail at what the image. So, my suggestion is, back off a little bit on that sharpening, because I think that is a little bit too much, a little bit what I like to call crunchy.
It's a good way to put it, for sure. I really appreciate this image, and I like the crop. For some reason it reminds me of it could be a poster on a kid's wall, even, like something like just quintessential Wild Wild West, like really epic image of, what these wild horses. And I would love to see like more of that brush, that like kind of dusty brown beige color on the bottom of the frame goes really nicely with that bay, that brown horse, and then kind of easing into the gray, and the gray horse kind of that sky is so beautiful, and I love that little texture in the clouds. It looks very storybook, and so it's really interesting how the different color palettes from the bottom of the frame versus the top of the frame really help kind of complement the horses and each of the respective horses' colors. So maybe, a little bit less of a crop so we could see even more of that, less of a sharpening so that, so it doesn't have that crunchy feel. But if you wouldn't mind, Juan, zooming into the horse's belly area where that texture is on the belly too, I think that would be really great, to not lose that detail, but to still see all of that movement in the fur. That would be awesome, because then your eye just goes directly into that horse's distressed look on its face as well, and there's just really beautiful flow to that image. It really looks truly like a Wild Wild West, like advertisement even. You could see that in a magazine. It's gorgeous. I love it.
Yeah, you made a great point about the sky, because the sky is so complimentary. It looks beautiful.
Yeah.
But I maybe bring the sky out a tiny bit more than it is, because it looks a little bit too pastel-y, if you will, a little bit too subtle. I may want to bring it in a little bit more to kind of complement sort of the mood that's going on with the two horses. And one way to do that, if you select that sky, it could be in Photoshop or Lightroom or wherever other way you want to do it. If you select the sky and you add a little bit of clarity, move that clarity slider a little bit, that will actually, don't overdo it, but that will actually bring out more detail and texture on that sky. So just something to think about. Okay, so we have 1 minute before we go, and we got to really finish off early. So let's take a quick look. One last image, and this was Elizabeth Payne, yeah, and this is a loon, quite a bit of distance. Sometimes these are challenging to photograph, especially if you don't have a super long lens. She's using a 100 to 400 at almost 400 millimeters. So sometimes, you got to be careful with the loons because they can be sometimes kind of skittish, and we certainly, especially during nesting season, we don't want to encroach on them too much, but you may want to think about getting a little closer so you don't have a subject that's so small in the scene. But again, this is another before and after edit. So let's look at the after image. This is her, the after image after she did all of that cropping and editing and zoom work. So this is great. I love, you're getting a different look on a loon that we traditionally see, which is pretty neat. We can still see quite a bit of color and detail in our bird, and we have a beautiful background that's complementary of our subject. But as we looked earlier, this is a pretty severe crop. I mean, we went from this to this, right? And then what happens when you do such a severe crop is that, I don't know if you can see how well you guys can see that, but if you look around these areas of high contrast between the black and the white of the neck of the loon and the black of the leg and the white of the water, you'll see there's some color fringing going on there. When you are zooming in so much, it's going to bring out all the flaws that our equipment has. And no lens is perfect. I'm not saying that your lens is no good. It is. It's a great lens. But what happens is when you have to end up zooming this much, you're going to bring out all the flaws in there. Lightroom can help you correct that to a certain extent. In the develop module, and Photoshop has this as well. You can do that in over here in the lens correction section. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing there, but you see this checkbox here is this chromatic aberration. That will remove that to a certain extent. But it can't probably do it in this particular image because it's such a large crop, and this is a JPEG, I believe. So you want to do that on the raw image itself. You don't want to do that. It's not as effective when you do that on a JPEG. But if you look under lens correction, you may be able to remove some of that chromatic aberration in there as well. So again, kind of interesting pose and nice background, but try to get in a little closer. In this particular case, I said earlier, try to get it more in the scene. I think you could have gotten a little closer, and you would end up with a better image. I'm sorry, Jennifer. Jaclyn, go ahead.
No problem. No, sorry to interrupt as well. That was just something I felt. If anyone has any questions about chromatic aberration and what that means, and if you're looking for any really helpful guides to that, Juan and David Swindler have their Images in Focus YouTube channel where they have discussed that in detail actually through their lens series. So I had some questions on that, and that was really helpful for me. But I think when applying edits like this and severe crops and such, that it would be really great to know and to remedy any kind of like potential situations in the future with your edits and with losing any detail or having any kind of muddling of pixels in that way.
That's a great thing that you mentioned that. If you don't mind, while I talk about something else, if you can get that URL, on YouTube and just post it onto the comments so that people have that.
Sure.
In case they want to look at it, that particular video that talks about lenses and whatnot, because that, that's an episode. We did a bunch of episodes. My friend David Swindler and I, on the Images in Focus video podcast, and we went, deep into vignetting and lens correction and all that kind of good stuff. So if you're interested in that, that's a great resource. And I want to apologize to the other two folks, Charles Taylor, who I know really well, and Jennifer Selbridge, that we didn't get to their images this time around. So we should make a note, Jennifer, to make sure that we prioritize them for the next round when we do our next image review live, and make sure that they are on top of the queue to do reviews. And I'm thinking that what we may, Jaclyn and I will talk a little bit about maybe changing the format a little bit, because I feel, and I'd like to get your guys' feedback, if you don't mind putting a comment, that, not just, I would prefer, and I think you guys could benefit, everybody can benefit from not just hearing about the image itself, but providing like the information that I just did, about, how to improve the image in the digital darkroom, whether it's with Lightroom or with Photoshop, and giving you a little bit more information on, how to capture image correctly, or how to edit it than just talk about a specific image. Because when we critique a specific image, that benefits mostly the photographer who took it, not as much as the other. Yeah, you can learn stuff, but I think that broadening it a little bit helps out a lot. So I'd like to hear from you guys what you think, if that's something that that you like, or you really would like us to just focus on the images themselves. Okay, folks, so that's it for this for this episode of Image Reviews Live. Again, we will set up another one for next month. I believe we have time to do one next month, maybe near the end of the month. I don't know. We're going to be, I don't know. We're going to be in Costa Rica from like the second half of the month through the beginning of October. So we'll have to figure that out. But keep on the lookout. If you have, go ahead.
And just big few weeks coming up. Lots of travel over the next few months and weeks and such, but we'll make it work at some point.
So keep an eye out on an announcement. And also, if you're not subscribed to our announcement mail list, make sure that you do that. And a way that you get to that is on your browser. You can go to pons.us/image review, right? Yes. And that will allow you to then go in and put in your name so that we can send you out a notice when the next image review is coming in. But I suspect that after this, we may make a few little changes to the way that we're asking for submissions, so that we're not getting as many submissions from people, so many submissions from any one person, so we can maybe get a few more people and also add a little bit more background to the scenes. Also, if I want to take this opportunity to plug in a little bit, some of the openings on the workshops. If you look at my workshop schedule, it's kind of crazy. Almost everything is sold out, but I recently had 2 openings for a workshop in Costa Rica coming up at the end of September. So if you haven't been, this is one of my favorite places in the world to go, because you will see more wildlife there than just about anywhere else in the world. It's just absolutely incredible, the amount of wildlife. I think we have one opening in Alaska in 2022. That's in May, I believe. It's
April into May. It's like April 27th to May 4th, 2022 in Alaska.
Okay. Because I have 2 workshops back to back, so it's the first one that has the opening, and that's one opening for a female passenger sharing a cabin with another female. So if you're interested in that, make sure to ping me and let me know. And we had one more opening we want to talk about.
There was another Costa Rica workshop as well.
In April. Yes.
In April. So there's an April Costa Rica 2022 opening, as well as an April into May Alaska 2022 opening. And you can see those if you were subscribed to the reminder for this event. You will see the live links to those openings at the bottom of that email, the bottom of that newsletter. But you can also just view the workshop openings on Juan's website, which is juanpons.com.
Thanks, folks, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining. Appreciate you all.